All right, welcome. We're coming to you live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to the week ahead. It's where we set the tone for you for the week ahead on the news front, where, as always, I'm your host, Liezle Wilson. Let's take a look at your top stories for today. Another alleged public violence instigator during last month's violent unrest and looting will appear in court tomorrow. 10,173 new cases of COVID-19 have been reported across the country. And in sports news, Cape Town City and Swallows FC clash in a first leg MTN 8 semi-final in the mother city today. Right, our top story for today on the week ahead. Members of Parliament and the ad hoc committee to amend Section 25 of the Constitution have been told to act according to the law and the Constitution. The ad hoc committee chairperson, Matole Motshekga, made the comment at a committee meeting and expressed frustration that the process to complete amending Section 25 is delayed by political party mandates on the Constitution's 18th Amendment Bill. Now, the lifespan of the ad hoc committee has been extended by yet another 2 weeks to complete its work and report back to the National Assembly. But for more on this, as we assess the progress of the ad hoc committee to date and perhaps explore a little further, we are joined by Advocate Mbeka Ngugai-Tobi. A very good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here on the week ahead. I think it's only befitting that we perhaps look at what has happened to date. I mean, the issue of land expropriation without compensation and whether it is in line with the Constitution has a two-pronged effect. What has been the work of the ad hoc committee to date upon this meeting again this week?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. So there are two processes, perhaps three processes that should be outlined. The first process was the process that led to the ad hoc committee itself, which is when in February 2018, there was a special committee of Parliament appointed in order to explore the feasibility of an amendment. It finished its work, it produced its report in August of that year. Since that process, we've had this ad hoc committee of Parliament to now look at the formulation of the amendment, because Parliament has decided that there should be an amendment to Section 25 of the Constitution. But it seems that the sticking point right now is what is the actual content of the amendment. And as I understand, there are three areas of disagreement. The first area of disagreement is the wording of the without compensation part to Section 25 2B. On the one hand, the ANC suggests a much more narrower form of an amendment which would target specific categories of land. The EFF disagrees with that. The second area of disagreement is the cutoff date for land claims. The current Constitution says that the cutoff date for land claims is the 19th of June, 1913. In other words, you can only go as far back as June 1913 and not beyond. And the third area, which has received quite a lot of media attention, has been the whole issue of state custodianship. In other words, should all land in South Africa be owned by the state, and individuals and corporations have regulated rights of access, exploitation, and perhaps disposal of land? Those have not been resolved. And what we have received instead is a draft which is very unsatisfactory in several respects, which firstly creates an ambiguity around whether or not the 1913 cutoff point will be maintained or scrapped. But it also creates an ambiguity as to whether or not there will be state custodianship or not, and if so, in what form. And even the clause relating to the actual compensation without, the actual expropriation without compensation is an ambivalently worded clause. So where we are right now, I'm afraid there hasn't been much progress since the last 4 years, and that seems to have been a largely wasted opportunity.
Well, looking at the ANC's handling of the process to date, I mean, we've seen that it does need the EFF support. but we've also heard that the EFF believes that the amending of Section 25 must include state custodianship, as you've alluded to, amongst other non-negotiable demands. But the ANC, says that it isn't going to let this happen. Leaders in the ANC, including former President Thabo Mbeki, are of the view that amending Section 25 is not going to happen. Is this an exercise in vain? I mean, will it help the ordinary person at large? And the stance, looking at factors of a possible deterrence related to foreign direct investment, how is this also going to impact decisions going forward?
Yes. I think let's split that question into two. The first question is, what is the nature and content of state custodianship? Unfortunately, there is ambiguity from the ANC, because that's where we should look, because they hold 57% in parliament. The ANC itself has not explained what it means by state custodianship. In other words, does it mean that private property as a concept is abolished altogether? Does it mean some form of private property will be allowed, but perhaps agricultural land will be owned by the state? Unless those questions are clearly articulated and outlined by the ANC, it is impossible to work out with any certainty whether or not we should take the ANC seriously on the concept of state custodianship. The EFF, one may disagree with their position, but they have been a lot clearer about what they mean by state custodianship. Their version of state custodianship is basically all land should be the inheritance and the custodianship of all South Africans, controlled, owned, and regulated by the state. And that our rights of occupation, our rights of exploitation, and our rights of disposal should be strictly regulated by the state. Now, my own personal view is not to endorse either of the two extreme positions, but to accept that some state custodianship is necessary and some state administration over the land is necessary. Because one of the reasons why we've had so much slow progress in relation to the land has been what I've referred to in my book as the land ownership veto. Landowners have too much power over the land. They decide which land is made available for sale. They decide the price of the land. They decide the use of the land. They even decide the beneficiaries over the land. There is no land reform process that can ever succeed in circumstances where landowners have so much dominance and control over the process. So shifting the process to state regulation is a positive step towards a much more meaningful land reform. But at the same time, that's one area that I strongly believe that the current model will not succeed because it concentrates too much power on landowners. But at the same time, you have to think, what do South Africans ordinarily actually want? What I know from my own experience, in relation to land claims under the restitution process, South Africans want land for themselves. They want to own the land. They don't want the land to be owned by the state. They want to own it. They also want to exploit it themselves. They want to farm themselves, and they want to own the produce of those farms. Even in relation to land redistribution, if you look at the two programs that the state follows, both programs are unsatisfactory in many respects. But in relation to the two programs that the state follows on land redistribution, which is the leasehold program, as well as the
All right, Advocate Mbeka and Ngugatobi, we're going to try and get you back on the line. Perhaps you could just start off by repeating the last part of your point. We did seem to lose you a little bit there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Am I connected now?
You're connected. Continue on the last point you were making.
Thank you very much. So on the land redistribution front, on two programs, ordinary people they apply for ownership, they apply for leasehold, but they never actually concede that the state should own or control the land. So you have a fundamental conflict that when the ordinary Africans, Black South Africans, are getting an opportunity for the first time to own land, the state is talking about stripping them away of those entitlements. And then on the third front, which is customary or ancestral land, even in relation to customary or communal or ancestral land, what ordinary South Africans want are greater powers of control over the stands that have been allocated to them. So they, even on that front, they do not agree with the notion that either the state or the chiefs should have custodianship over those areas of the land. So we have to think carefully about what form of state control do we grant the state, and what form of individual, family, and community control do we give over the land. But what I disagree with is this idea that any form of state custodianship will be opposed and it will not even be debated. What I do think is that there has to be an area in which the state exercises greater powers than it currently has. But the ultimate ownership of the land should be to the people, not upwards to the state.
Well, the numbers currently in Parliament, as you've alluded to, don't favour the ANC to go alone in the amendment of Section 25. I think my question to you is it ultimately going to happen the way things are unfolding politically? I mean, what is the process now that the parliamentary process has been stalled?
Yes. Well, I mean, that's an interesting point, actually. That's a good point, not just interesting. The political process is a very dynamic one. It's usually give or take. And often politicians will give you one thing on land in exchange for getting something on an unrelated topic like agriculture or perhaps defense. So one never knows until the process has played itself out whether or not there will be a give and take that will result in an amendment. But on the facts that we know right now, the amendment looks extremely unlikely. The EFF's position is quite clear that they won't support a kind of a regulated ad hoc form of compensation regime. They're also quite clear that they won't accept anything that will not result in state custodianship. And the ANC is clear on its position. The DA has made it absolutely clear that any form of an amendment will be opposed. So what the ANC should be looking at right now is alternatives to achieving a form of expropriation without compensation, which, by the way, it can achieve through the passing of national legislation. This comes back, and I hate to say this because I'm sounding like a broken record. This comes back to something some of us have argued for the past 4 years, that this entire constitutional amendment process is a monumental waste of time. If the ANC wants serious progress on land, what it should do right now is to pass the expropriation bill. It needs no one because it can achieve that by 50+1%. It must pass a land redistribution bill. It must pass a compensation policy. And it must begin to give land to the people. And it must stop with the gimmicks.
Well, state capacity and corruption concerns in the short and long term also emerge. I mean, how do we overcome these deficiencies within the system and also adopt the correct political action and mechanisms for the benefit of South Africa, for her people, obviously so that justice prevails and crimes against the social and economic ramifications of apartheid are corrected?
Yes, true. In fact, that's the question we should be debating.
Yeah. And
think about it. If we had spent the last 4 years, which has gone into this expensive but ultimately wasteful exercise, if we had spent the last 4 years working on how to create state capacity for the management of the land reform process, which includes creating a better functioning commission for land reform, creating a better functioning Department of Land Affairs and Agriculture, and creating a more empowered beneficiary class for land claims. A lot of people who get land simply do not have the skills and the capacity, not farming skills. A lot of black people have farming skills, but it's on the commercial side, on the business skills that they need a lot of empowerment. Now, if we had spent a lot of our energies focusing on those, we would have made much more progress. And we know that one of the elements that are scuttling land reform is corruption. So if we had spent a lot of time actually trying to stop the corruption in the land reform program. We also know that one of the reasons why land reform has been so slow is the institutional capacity across the board. And you had spent a lot of time focusing on the strengthening of the institutional capacity. I mean, this idea that you can have an agrarian revolution program without state capacity, and you can have a chaotic program that will ultimately result, seems to be total utopia. And so there are things we know should be done, but we have not done them. But we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. They can be done right now, only if we have enough political will. I call the ANC's stance on the land reform program, at least on the evidence available in the past 4 years, gimmicks. So if we abandon the gimmicks and focus on the work that needs to be done, we can in fact achieve a lot better than we are right now. I mean, think about the fact that we have so many pending restitution claims. Restitution was closed in December 1998, but we still have claims that have not yet been resolved. And think about the fact that we still have pending claims on the labor tenant side. And labor tenant claims were closed 15 years ago, and we still have not resolved them. So we are spending a lot of time making promises, and on the things that have to be done, those things are not being done.
Well, Advocate Mbeka, let me conclude this conversation by just perhaps looking at the land reform processes that have been underway whilst the amendment of Section 25 is currently being looked at. I think my question to you is what has been in the process? Has there been any other forms of expropriation with compensation whilst we iron out what expropriation without compensation looks like in South Africa?
Yes, thank you. Again, that's another brilliant question. The problem in South Africa has not been compensation. The problem of the slow pace of land reform has not been compensation. It's been overcompensation. It's been the fact that the government has insisted on paying above market-related payments to landowners. Yet, as early as 1996, the ANC negotiated for itself a regime in terms of which it will have no duty to pay market-related compensation. In fact, in certain instances, it could even not pay any compensation. But it has never applied this power, nor has it even applied the power of expropriation itself. It has the power to expropriate, it has the power to pay market-related, it has the power to refuse to pay market-related compensation, but those have not been applied at all. Where things stand right now is we should be working towards developing a national policy on compensation, which will begin with zero compensation on deserving cases to above market-related compensation on deserving cases. We need a spectrum of compensation, but that spectrum should be guided by the clause in the Constitution that says compensation must be just and equitable.
All right, Advocate Mbeka Ngugaitobi, thank you very much for your time. Again, just chatting about Parliament, busy with the process of amending Section 25's property clause to allow for expropriation without compensation, or in fact to make explicit that which is implied in Section 25, that in some cases compensation for expropriation could amount to nil. While the ad hoc committee tasked with this made to process public submissions this week, again, Advocate Mbeka Ngugaitobi chatted about the process of the ad hoc committee's work to date. Again, thank you very much for your time. It's time for a quick ad break. We continue with more news on the other side of this. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. This is the week ahead with myself, Liezle Wilson, political reporter, joins us for a look at the political diary for the week ahead. And Nhlanhla, if you can hear me, I think the question to you is, what is on the proposed diary on the political front for the week ahead?
Well, good day to you, Liezle, and our viewers. This week is going to be a very interesting one regarding the political diary. First thing to look out for will be the ANC's application to the Electoral Court to try and get another opportunity for registering. If you remember, some political parties have cried foul, stating that technical glitches were there during the registration, stating that that's amongst the reasons why they found it hard to register. Another story to look out for, and that this has been on our radar for quite some time, is former President Jacob Zuma's rescission application. We're also going to pay a close eye on the development around instigators of the recent protests that ravaged KZN and Gauteng province. Lastly, the upcoming local government elections remains to be an issue. You know that we have only 2 months left before the election, so those stories remain to be on our radar. With that being said, just keep your eye glued on SABC News as we'll be giving you those political stories.
All right, Nhlanhla Kgatlana, thank you very much for joining us, political reporter, chatting about the political diary for the week ahead. Moving on from local news now, we're going to take a look at news further afield. Joining us is SABC News International Editor, Sophie Mukwena. Very good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. The fourth quarter for this year promises quite the events. I mean, South Sudan's Vice President and President Salva Kiir agreeing to integrate their forces, but obviously we've also seen some breakaway groups from Machar having reportedly retreated back to the bushes. I mean, what's the latest happening in the north?
Well, of course, as you know, that President Salva Kiir, the president of South Sudan, has agreed with the Vice President Riek Machar to integrate the forces. But unfortunately, there's a breakaway part of the Riek Machar people, and therefore that is posing a serious problem in terms of peace and security in South Sudan.
Well, moving on from South Sudan and taking a look at what's unfolded within the Tigray crisis. I mean, it's in the spotlight once again, and it comes after the Security Council met on Thursday. Now, as we monitor the outcomes of the resolutions proposed there, what are we also expecting from them?
On Thursday, the Security Council of the United Nations did meet, and the AU did announce during the meeting that they have appointed the former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, to lead a mediation team that is going to look at this Tigray crisis. But clearly there's a humanitarian crisis, and the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has called on the international community to assist. But there's hope that perhaps former President Olusegun Obasanjo will be able to bring parties together, and perhaps a solution will be found.
Well, as we move to Zambia, I mean, now that the newly elected president, Hakainde Hichilema, has been sworn in, I mean, when can we expect the cabinet to be appointed? And also, what are some of the biggest issues that he will be tackling as he takes up office?
We expect Parliament to resume on Friday, and immediately he will be able to appoint his cabinet. But he has already announced the person who is the finance minister. The intention was to ensure that immediately you are able to give direction in terms of the economic perspective, but also to ensure that investors are able to assess you in terms of your sense of agency in addressing the economic challenges the country is facing. We expect that he will focus on rebuilding the economy. As you are aware that due to COVID-19 and perhaps earlier, Zambia was having serious economic challenges.
All right, so we've obviously taken a look at South Africa, moved further up into the continent, looking at news further afield as we continue to monitor the US's withdrawal deadline from Afghanistan, and also the relations between China and Russia with, their relationships with the Taliban. How's this geopolitical landscape playing out as we speak?
It's a race against time for the United States of America to finish this dangerous mission. We know that on the 31st of August, that's the deadline that America spoke about in terms of finalizing the withdrawal. But the reality is that you still have many Americans who are all over Afghanistan, and they have announced, the Pentagon, that those Americans shouldn't come near the airport. And therefore the question is, how will you be able to evacuate everybody when you have fears that there's likely to be an attack at the airport, and therefore asking people not to go to the airport? Therefore, we'll see what happens. But it is really a dangerous mission. And President Joe Biden did indicate that they will continue to revenge against ISIS-K. And therefore, the situation is very, very tense.
Yeah, well, staying in the north, the northern hemisphere, in fact, we've also seen an increase in global COVID-19 numbers. It's on the increase. This, of course, as the northern hemisphere approaches winter. Now, with some countries still accessing vaccines, I mean, how is this resurgence going to affect vaccine rollout and also the dynamics which lie ahead for the entire globe?
Sub-Sahara is still struggling to procure vaccines, but the Africa CDC is working very hard to ensure that all countries are able to vaccinate the population. But unfortunately, the problem is that you need to put aside a lot of money to procure lots and lots of vaccines, because the developed North have taken a decision to buy these vaccines. And therefore, in terms of these pharmaceutical companies, they always tend to deal with orders from the North, the developed North, particularly the G7 countries. We know that currently when we look at the stats, we find that 200 million cases have been reported of COVID-19 since the outbreak. You have over 4 million people who have died during during this pandemic, and we don't have a solution right now. Yes, the vaccine, they do help in terms of assisting, particularly to ensure that you don't have a pressure, particularly to the healthcare, because the numbers of people who are admitted in hospitals tend to be low, and also you are able to minimize the death. But the reality is the non-pharmaceutical interventions are still the best option, where you continue to use your mask, sanitize, keep a social distance, but also avoid crowded places. We know that in the Sub-Sahara, there are countries who are already reporting a fourth wave. We know that South Africa is currently experiencing a third wave, but the minister last week pointed out that we are likely to ride straight into the storm of the fourth wave because of the recent gatherings that we saw during the protests, and with electioneering, particularly for local government elections coming, we are going to see crowds, and therefore it will be very difficult to control the pandemic, and therefore we may easily experience the fourth wave sooner than later.
All right, Sophie, let's wrap up the conversation lastly by taking a look at the September diary. I mean, the UN General Assembly at the end of September will be meeting, but ahead of this, there are many site meetings and interactions that will occur in the build-up to this. All this supposedly happening hybrid, having a hybrid approach rather, given the COVID-19 pandemic and also what's happening in certain pockets of the world. What can we expect as this new month approaches on that front?
It is a very important gathering, annual meeting, where the members of the United Nations, all member countries, they converge and they talk about challenges facing the world, particularly the COVID-19 issues related to peace and security. But unfortunately, again, we are not going to see leaders going to New York for this gathering. It is going to be a hybrid. Majority of leaders will be virtual. Maybe those, particularly in North and South America, will be able to attend. But it will be a very, very limited number, because the United Nations is trying to ensure that you don't have large numbers at the UN present to avoid infection. And we hope that high on the agenda will be COVID-19 again, particularly issues related to how you rebuild the economy.
Yes.
Building better, that is building the economy of the world, and pressure on the G20 countries to ensure that they are able to come up with a deal that will assist the poorer nations or developing countries to be able to rebuild their economy, because no one is safe until all of us are safe.
No, absolutely. Again, thank you very much for your time today. That was SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena chatting about the international diary for the week ahead, this as we enter the month of September. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you very much for tuning in. From myself, Liezle Wilson, and the rest of the team, until next time, it is goodbye.